Ryan Reynolds here for, I guess, my 100th Mint commercial. No, don't. I mean, honestly, when I started this, I thought I only have to do like 4 of these. I mean, it's unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month. How are there still people paying 2 or 3 times that much? I'm sorry, I shouldn't be victim blaming here. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/save. Whenever you're ready.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
Hello, Quiet Rioters, and welcome to the show that bathes you in hugs while also giving you a weekly political to-do list. I'm Naomi Smith.
And I'm Alex Andreou. Pleased that order is restored and Kenny has been banished back to his unmicrophoned corner.
I am not one to boast, except I am. And I honestly believe that we have the most clever and kind listeners of any podcast, because every day you flood us with insightful messages, alert us to things we may have missed, and you do it with a huge amount of warmth and generosity. And it kind of makes me a bit emotional from time to time, and I do feel incredibly lucky. So I just wanted to start the show with a thank you.
And you have not only spoken your appreciation, you have shown your appreciation by supporting us on ko-fi.com/Quiet Riot Pod. Please continue to do so. We are halfway to sustainability and probably a quarter of the way to world domination.
In the meantime, get yourself a cornetto, get yourself comfortable, and slip into today's Quiet Riot.
Welcome to Quiet Riot. I'm Alex.
And I'm Naomi. This week, our mums have bought us new, slightly too big school shoes. We've treated ourselves to a brand new pencil case. And we're thinking up new and ever more inventive ways to get out of PE, because it's a new term. So we'll be talking you through what's on the timetable, from tough double maths with Rachel Reeves to woeful sex education with Kemi Badenoch.
And for every minute you are angry, you lose 60 seconds of happiness, wrote the famously mellow Albert Camus. Those words are very close to this podcast's mission. So today we talk happiness. What is it? Why is it so elusive? And what we can practically do to pour it into every crevice of our lives.
All of this and the return of Tryl with it. I'm not too sure those people are particularly happy.
And joining us today is an actual happiness doctor. Well, not really, but I like to think of him that way. He's a professor of behavioural science at the LSE and the author of the Sunday Times bestseller Happiness by Design and Happy Ever After. Welcome, Paul Dolan.
Hello, thank you so much for having me on.
Paul, you also do a spot of podcasting and substacking and a little bit of everything. We will drop links to all your various outputs in the show notes. And this week, you were uncharacteristically unhappy about the pricing of Oasis tickets. Why was that?
Well, is that right? No, I was unhappy at people's reactions to the price of tickets to watch a band that split up 20 years ago and has made no new music since. No, it was an interesting comment on, well, no, it was a comment. It'd be for others to judge whether it was interesting. It was a comment on dynamic pricing and how we accept it with Uber, with airline tickets, with hotels, and yet people are up in arms about it to go and watch a couple of middle-aged men perform.
Bridget Phillipson doesn't accept it for school holiday airfare, so she's trying to get them to not do that.
Yeah, but it was really more a kind of half-assed joke at watching bands that have no new music.
I sense you were never a massive Oasis fan.
You see, no, well, I was at the time, but you know, the world's moved on. My latest work is on trying to get us to listen to people that we disagree with more, to reduce what I call beliefism. And that's a real challenge for me because I'm a bit of a music snob. So I'm trying to be more understanding of people who.
Yeah, it was funny. You put out like music. A short clip saying, grow up, you pant.
Well,
and then you put another clip out.
Like that.
And then you put another clip out saying, Look, I was just joking.
Yeah, I
right?
did. Yeah,
I love
you know
really.
that because you put it out. Oh, look, did I actually say that? No, I just have to rein it in a bit. But I do. I have to draw the line at Coldplay. I mean, that is one thing that I just cannot. I cannot for the life of me. If anybody said that they actively like Coldplay,
I actively like.
yeah,
Coldplay.
well,
I'm
that's.
so
Shall we?
sorry.
You're not. Yeah. Do you know? As an aside, Seth Stevens-Daviditch, who wrote Everybody Lies, where he wrote about all the Google searches that people do. He also has Spotify data, and he can predict relatively accurately when you were born based upon the songs you have on your playlist, because
that's amazing.
girls tend to have songs they listened to when they were like 12, 13, boys when they were like a little bit older, 14, 15.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Also joining us is a regular Quiet Rioter, director of More in Common. It's Luke Tryl. Welcome back, Luke.
Thanks for having me back.
By the time the show goes out, we are going to know which of the 6 MP hopefuls has been knocked out of the Westminster Conservative leadership race, because remember there are 2 Conservative Party
And we're
leadership
doing an
races
episode
happening.
on it next week.
Great. So if you want to know about what's happening north of the border for the Conservatives, tune into that. Luke, I'm not going to do that horrible thing of asking you to make a prediction, but for those that want to unpick what the result tonight might mean for the race, what should we be looking out for in the numbers and the briefings that are going to happen?
It's a really good question. And I must confess, as well as having a lovely summer holiday, I also spent the summer doing 10 focus groups with people who abandoned the
Workaholic.
Conservatives in 2019. So voted Conservative in 2019 and then abandoned them in this election and actually tested all of the leadership candidates with them. So I feel like I can recite their campaign videos almost by heart. I'm not going to do it, listeners. But I could if I wanted to. But I think it's going to be really interesting. And I think there are 2 big things to look out for. I think we can broadly predict that Robert Jenrick and Kemi Badenoch are going to be the top 2, but quite what the scale is, and I think the gap between them is going to be really interesting, And then for the other 4, obviously someone will be knocked out, but then what I'd be looking for is who is the one that probably demonstrates they've got enough support to try and take on those 2 front runners. What's interesting about this round of MPs ballots is previously they've been very quick. It's been Tuesday, Thursday. And so actually momentum has built around the front runner very quickly. In this case, we're going to have another ballot next week. So that's a big gap there. And then we're waiting till the 4 conference speeches. Yeah. And we know that in 2005, it was that conference speech which took David Cameron from basically almost being an also-ran to being a real contender in the race. There was a Frank Luntz focus group which said he'd done well. David Davis was seen to have bombed. So what I would say is, unlike previous contests, there'll be a lot of noise around this first ballot, and it'll give us some indication. But I think that more than any other race, we'll see lots of changes between ballots simply because there's such a big gap and you've got that all-important conference speech.
And of course, this time I have a vote.
Oh, yeah.
I got my card the other day.
You did?
I did.
Well, I look forward to the readout
attitude.
from your first Conservative Association meeting. They're bound to be in touch soon to invite you along.
Never going to happen.
Quiet Riot.
First, after Kenny utterly shamed us with his remarkable and frankly quite moving performance on the week in 60 Seconds last time, it's back to Naomi and me to mangle and mince our media headlines from the last 7 days.
I'm such a winner!
Buckle up, brace yourselves, and be amazed at the week in 60 seconds. In 3, 2, 1... go.
Britain's state pension is expected to rise £400 a year, which coincidentally is the new price of a Freddo.
7 people were attacked by gulls and left with cut heads in Eyemouth. Meanwhile, in Cockermouth, no one talks about their injuries, they just limp and whimper.
New research shows Tory politicians are starting to be seen as weird. It's unclear whether that's relative to other party MPs, which would be quite a feat, or in isolation.
Oldham was declared Britain's coldest, wettest place during a miserable summer. Think 90 days of a Rishi Sunak press conference.
Blair's new book references Moses. Both were helped by Red Seas, both befriended strange bushes. Though only Moses found what he was looking for in the desert.
Team GB's Paralympians continue to impress. The last time our archers were this successful in France, they had to paddle back from Agincourt.
Filming has started on the last ever episode of Gavin and Stacey, which is expected to be the second most popular thing on Christmas Day after the end of the King's Speech.
Elon Musk suggested the world should be run by high-status men, which is an actual anagram of shit agents hum.
A beluga whale once suspected of spying for Russia has been found dead in Norway, believed to have fallen from an 18th floor window. Russia has denied any involvement. Stop the clock.
108.
Okay, not bad. That's not bad.
That's not bad.
Okay.
It's less than he did last week.
Well, on to our first item. It's a new term, and Westminster has finally gone back to school for a very brief session before Parliament rises yet again for the party conference season next week. This means they've got a lot to pack into a few short days. The Tory MPs will start their first rounds of voting to eliminate 2 of the 6 leadership hopefuls. All MPs will vote for who they want to head up all of the various select committees. Scottish Conservatives will be picking their new leader, and the government is set to begin renationalising all rail franchises. Outside of Parliament, former Liberal Democrat donor turned friend of Tufton Street, the hedge fund tycoon Paul Marshall, is set to buy The Spectator, adding to his existing media collection of GBBs and Unheard. His bid for The Telegraph, meanwhile, has gone quiet. But the big news really is the second report from the Grenfell inquiry. So let's start with that.
Mr. Speaker, I want to speak directly to the bereaved families, the survivors, and those in the immediate Grenfell community, some of whom are with us in the gallery today. Sir Martin concluded this morning, and I'm afraid there's no way of repeating this that won't be painful. He said the simple truth is that the deaths that occurred were all avoidable, and that those who lived in the tower were badly failed over a number of years and in a number of different ways by, as the report lays out in full, just about every institution responsible for ensuring their safety. I want to say very clearly on behalf of the country, you've been let down so badly before, during and in the aftermath of this tragedy. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to start with an apology on behalf of the British state to each and every one of you, and indeed to all of the families affected by this tragedy. It should never have happened. The country failed to discharge its most fundamental duty, to protect you and your loved ones, the people that we are here to serve, and I am deeply sorry.
Alex, I think you were following the report publication this morning.
I mean, scathing in one word. We're talking about the fire that killed 72 people, basically because the cladding that was attached to the building was flammable. The final report from the inquiry says that it was the result of dishonest companies, successive governments, and the lack of strategy by the fire service. So nobody gets off scot-free from this one. There is plenty of blame to go around everyone. Starmer has responded with an unreserved apology, which was very good to see. It was completely unqualified. It was like the state let you down. He's announced a sort of review of everything behind the scenes that went wrong, and has also said that companies involved in any way with it will be blocked from bidding for government contracts. All of that is good to see. There may have been a statement on remediation work for other buildings with similar cladding. I haven't seen anything on that because that's quite a big bill,
I think there's well over 3,500 buildings that still have the flammable cladding. And when you think those buildings probably have potentially hundreds of occupants or units within them, we really are still talking about an enormous number of British people living in fire hazardous conditions. And of course, if they are mortgage holders on any of those, an inability to sell them. So quite literally being trapped within an unsafe building. It's been 7 years.
Incredible.
Really, really incredible. Luke, the day it happened was very soon after Theresa May's I don't want to call it victory, but after 2017 general election where she lost the Conservative majority and was leading a minority administration, I've never seen a Prime Minister look so visibly shocked by anything in my life. Were you surprised, as somebody's probably involved in sort of being a political advisor around that time, at the kind of paralysis it seemed from the outside that there was to the government response at the time?
Well, it did. I mean, those images, as you say, of Theresa May at the time, and it was, as you say, coming very quickly off that election where she massively underperformed expectations. And I think, unfortunately for Theresa May, it revealed, Theresa May has many strengths, not least her constituency work, but I think it also revealed some of her brittleness that also went on to be on show in a different way during the Brexit negotiations, and she was unable to do it. And it does, it has been 7 years, and I think it is fair to say that no one really started getting a proper grip of this until Michael Gove went into what was then the Department for Levelling Up, which still had responsibility for housing. But if you remember, at the end of the last government, it was his frustration with the rest of government and the wider industry was becoming clear, because he was sort of saying, why are we not making more progress on this? And it'll be interesting to see now, if the inquiry having come out, Angela Rayner having taken over the department, whether they can carry that on. Because I think it did become a classic example of, yes, Theresa May's brittleness to begin with, but then towards the end of the Sunak administration, the kind of stasis and inertia. I mean, they did some things, made some progress, but it wasn't enough. And as I say, that frustration from Gove was almost palpable at the end. It
really was. And housing and new homes is very much a feature of the new government, but they've really got to get a handle on this. I suppose at the time I couldn't believe that the Conservative-led government, because they were sort of in a confidence and supply arrangement with the DP, weren't throwing money at it. If that had happened to me on my watch, I'd have been like, this is so catastrophically awful and disastrous. Let us just throw an immense amount of money at it. I don't know that that's been done, really. I mean, I know a lot has been spent, but the Labour government now, 7 years on, with even more brittle economic situation to oversee, has the bandwidth to be able to do that, or the appetite to want to do that?
I was just going to make a comment on public inquiries about, I mean, it's easy to say things from the outside, but it takes so fucking long.
7 years.
It takes so long. It's unfathomable that it should take that time.
Well, I mean,
but like everyone is the same, isn't it? They're always years
infected
after.
Blood. It's been 40 years.
Decades after.
Yeah.
There's something broken in the system of public inquiries, isn't there?
And is it broken, or is it broken by design? Because part of their function is to put distance between the people in charge and the blame, as it were, because it seems to me that that's built into it.
Except for then, I guess the counter to that is, and I actually think public inquiries are, the length of time is unacceptable, but they do have a weight, I think, that almost nothing else does with their findings. And that's why I sort of contrast this inquiry with the COVID inquiry, which to me I just thought has become a circus. It seemed to be much more interested in, Dom Cummings' text messages about Helen McNamara, which, interestingly as they are for all of us, hardly seem to really inquiry. I think is an example
I don't fully accept that, Luke. I think it has become that in terms of the hearings. But if you read the report of the first module, I think it is anything but that, actually. It's a very serious piece of work. I fully accept that the hearings became a sort of weird gossip column.
But the point stands because in aggregate, when you look at whether it's the thalidomide scandal in the 60s and 70s, whether it's the infected blood scandal of the 80s and early 90s, whether it is COVID inquiry, whether it is, any one of these things. Not Hillsborough, indeed. Justice delayed is justice denied. These things do take too long, and they never seem to have an impact on us avoiding the next great big scandal. So I think, while I agree with you, Alex, on the substance of some of the reporting, whether or not they have an impact in changing anything for the better, I agree with Paul. I sort of don't think that they do.
And other countries do it quicker. That is certainly the case. I mean, other countries' COVID inquiries, for instance, were sort of up and running in 3 months. And obviously, part of it is ours are judicial-led, which means you can compel people to do. It has lots of benefits. But it does make me think, we should be learning from elsewhere. What can you do quickly? Counter to that, of course, is Bloody Sunday, where some of the initial reviews that were done basically ended up being a whitewash because they accepted the arguments from organs of the state that were given, and the actual inquiry was much more detailed and thorough in getting to it. So it's one of those sort of trade-offs that's hard to...
I mean, at a really basic level, I find it unfathomable. I was watching a report this morning, actually, on Sky News, of people living in a high-rise building with exactly the same kind of cladding, put there by the exact same company, and explaining how they keep their phone, their keys, a wallet with some money and their passport on the bedside table in case they have to flee the building
in the middle of the night.
And that to me, it just seems unfathomable that we cannot come together to say this is important. It's just not acceptable for people to live in those kinds of circumstances. And to think, which is the step that neither the inquiry has taken nor anyone will take, but to think that the primary driver for what happened was that other residents in what is a very posh area didn't like the way the building looked. That was what drove all of it. It was a cosmetic exercise to dress up what basically people whose houses are worth 2 million thought was an eyesore. And that, to me, implies that perhaps something deeper is needed about our priorities, as a society. Like, what do we value? What is it we value?
The behavioural sciences teach us lots of lessons about how to change people's behaviour, but standard economic theory says people respond to incentives. That's very, very basic. And that's often financial incentives. So you don't have to look very much further than seeing what the monetary benefits are involved in certain actions. But also reputational incentives, and particularly the threat of prison. I'm not one for sending people to jail all the time, but if you've really faced the prospect that you might go to jail for what you do, that's very chastening. So we saw in the financial crash in the 80s, I mean, Save and Poor, there were hundreds of people went to jail as a result of that. During the financial crash of 2008, Bernie Madoff maybe, if he'd, not taken his own life. I mean, if there's not a significant incentive for you to act in a particular way, then all these inquiries in the world will be words that won't really be properly acted upon.
Can I give you the counter to that, though, is that there is, I certainly think there is some evidence that also no blame cultures actually lead to better kind of whistleblowing and reporting in advance. True, yeah. And of course, one of the things which I suspect we might go on to talk about is Ofsted and
well, indeed.
The reform.
You've done a very smooth segue there.
I have a note here because I know that education is very interesting.
But I worked for them. But if you look at the head, but just to finish on that, the head that killed herself in large part, what seems to have come out of the inquiry was the consequences of inspection. Yeah. It was less, and the more we add consequences to shining a light on things, the more there are pressures in the other direction as well. So wherever you sort of squeeze the sausage, is that the word? It comes out of different ends. And
I was going to say that the two words that my students always say I use a lot when I teach is context matters. It's basically my get out of jail free card for not being able to answer a difficult question, but it's actually true. And so, I mean, if we have the really important point there is that we can't have generalizable rules for everything all of the time.
Yeah.
And you're absolutely right. There will be certain environments where no blame cultures are actually much more effective than sending people to prison.
Luke, you were, of course, a policy advisor within the Department for Education, a political advisor. And this week we've heard that Bridget Phillipson is really not keen on the one-word rating that Ofsted gives a school: good, outstanding, underperforming, whatever it is. What were your immediate thoughts on that?
And I should say, I do have an interest because, as being an advisor, after I finished working for Nikki in the Department for Education, I went to Ofsted and was a civil servant as a strategy director at Ofsted. So, worked with the team and know Amanda, the outgoing chief inspector, very well. My view with these things, it's always a trade-off, right? On the one hand, of course, there is more to a school than a single judgment, and that's why you have the full narrative report that comes with it. I think there have been problems with the fact Ofsted hasn't been funded well enough to go into enough detail to support schools, and inspections been cut back and cut back and cut back. And, I think that's just... So I can see why they have got rid of the one word. On the other hand, you have to balance that with the fact that lots of parents are time poor. They don't have time to read lengthy reports. They want to know up front, is this school doing a good enough job for my child? And it's worth remembering 90% of schools are rated good or outstanding, right? So it is just the 10%. It's not like there's this sort of across the board, lots of schools are being deemed to fail. I think the interim arrangements that they've come to are actually quite sensible, because there are 4 judgments underneath the overall judgment: leadership and management, quality of education, as the sort of behaviour one, and a well-being one, broadly. Now, if a school gets inadequate on leadership and management, you're going to know
Red
there's
flag.
a problem with that school. You're going to know as a parent, you're going to know as government, you have to act if there's a problem with quality of education. So I think keeping it at the 4 is okay. My worry is if it goes to a sort of 20 indicator report card, you start to look at that and go, is that more important than that? And is that more important than that? And I think that would be the way. So I think when they're designing this new report card to come in, I think next September, they've got to get that balance right. And I do think there's a bigger risk for Labour here, which is, they had to settle with the junior doctors. It was a no-brainer, and Sunak should have done it. The train drivers was a bit more debatable and more contentious. But of course, this move comes off the back of pressure from the unions. There is just a risk that a narrative starts to emerge that the government is doing more for public sector workers than it is for public sector users, and that's where their interests lie, particularly in the context of difficult decisions across the board. And I think they've just got to take care on that in the narrative, because you could see that emerging. You could see it becoming a Tory reform attack line on them. So I think they've got to, it's a matter of balance.
Just, to drop in the usual caveat, public sector workers are also public sector users, and there's a fuck of a lot of them.
That's very true.
But all of that aside, in my mind, the problem was that squeeze on resources that meant basically inspections happened in the space of one day. You have a bad day, you're fucked. That can't be right. No. It's not really, the problem is not with the rating. The problem is that the inspection needs to happen over really a longer period, give chances to the school to fix stuff before going public and saying this school is rubbish.
Oh, I think absolutely in terms of the depth and length of inspection. But the problem was, and of course, if you're the Treasury, if you're the Department for Education, when you've got to make cuts, it's always easy to cut an inspectorate because no one's gonna, no one's gonna cry about you taking money, and that's what happened. And Amanda Spielman, the outgoing chief inspector, has said it is reduced inspection to a core. And we always focus on the punitive side of inspection, but actually there's a good, for lots of schools, even schools that are rated good, if they get an inspection, it can give them pointers on how to be even better. And that's where, lots of inspection should be. But I think, it just simply has been cut too much.
You're dead right. As a CEO, I've recoiled from the performance management processes I had inflicted on me before I ran an organisation. And I railed against an appraisal process. And I think an annual and mid-term appraisal process is wrong. I think you should just be having continuous improvement throughout the year. All staff should know broadly on any given day of the week whether their managers think they're doing a decent job or something needs improvement. And I think the pressure that you put on people and organisations and whatever it is around a kind of a one-day thing is completely ridiculous.
Well, just one counter, and again, to be careful, is if you look at areas where they have weaker inspectorates, Scotland and Wales, we have seen their standards and ratings on international league tables absolutely tumble. So there is definitely a role for a strong inspector. There's also problems with their curriculum as well. But there is a role for a strong inspectorate. It's just getting that balance right.
Paul, universities.
Yes.
Is there anything, we can glean from how they're assessed that might be useful to the school sector?
It's an interesting question. We've had the Research Excellence Framework, the REF, for a number of years, a couple of decades now. Pretty much not long after.
It was the RAE and then the REF.
It was the RAE, exactly that, Research Assessment Exercise, Research Excellence Framework. And it's broadly the same thing. It's you submit your papers to a panel who assess the quality of your work. And it's, typically your 4 best papers over the review period. And I would think, I mean, again, this will be a generalisation where, of course, context matters, but I do think that, like most other targets in most other sectors probably, it's done a very good job at getting rid of the tails, in the sense that the lazy academics who did very little have now had to do something, or, you know, they've been held to account in a way that they previously weren't. And that's a good thing. And that's an absolutely good thing. But also probably at the top tail, in the sense that it sort of stifles maybe a bit of creativity, interdisciplinarity, because we get submitted to panels based on disciplines. Yeah. So if you're doing amazing interdisciplinary work, it's kind of where do you fit and where do you sit? So I think...
And isn't there something called the Lysenko effect or something about the number of citations a paper has got goes towards your kind of overall score, but that if you were being cited for poor work, there was this sort of perverse impact on it. I'm
it's
sure
true, and it's kind of like these things with metrics generally, is that they serve a purpose to begin with, and then sometimes the metrics then become not fit for purpose. And you need to shift and pivot to other means of assessment. Right. And I think that's probably the case in universities, as it is probably in most other sectors.
I mean, that bit about the top end is interesting, because it's not just the left who criticise some of Ofsted's grades. Actually, one of the biggest critics is Catherine Berbelsing, who I know is a friend of the podcast, and she says that it stifles excellence. You know, and she obviously runs a school which, leave aside some of her statements, does very well, and she says it's too constraining in a box. So there is definitely that pressure at the top as well as at the bottom.
I want to move us on. Kemi Badenoch, running for the Tory leadership, as we all know, has chosen Doctor Who, of all people, to criticise this week, and maybe in her own version of Wokie Dokie. I don't know.
I think she thinks Doctor Who is real. She's put out a campaign video saying, I'm not afraid of Doctor Who. I'm going to take him on.
Until we wake up and Kemi Badenoch doesn't exist anymore, I don't wish ill of her, I just wish her to shut up.
No, I will not shut up. When you have that type of cultural establishment trying to keep conservatives down, you need someone like me who's not afraid of Doctor Who or whoever, and who's going to take the fight to them and not let them try and keep us down. That's not going to happen with me.
So I'm going to defend Kemi
Feel free.
on that, because I thought what David Tennant did was actually quite ugly, because he was basically telling a senior woman in politics to shut up. I thought it was really unattractive, actually. And I do think what was interesting from our focus groups that we did is one of the things that people like about Kemi Badenoch is she tells it like it is. She's refreshing.
The authenticity point that
she's
we know
authentic. She's honest.
Well.
I think the danger for her is that she goes too far and picks a fight with too many people, and it becomes exhausting for Tory MPs and that type of thing, and reining in. I actually thought standing up to someone like David Tennant, who's a man in a very privileged position, who I said I did find it quite ugly. It was okay. I think what she's got to pivot to now is, okay, you can do the fighty bit. What's the substance?
Luke, come on. She was a Secretary of State, and he disagreed with the policy she was putting out,
which is
there.
fine.
To somehow suggest he told the cleaner or the dinner lady to shut up, and it was very ugly because of the power differential, because he's very privileged. She's a Secretary of State. she needs to be able to take that kind of criticism.
Well, you should be able to take criticism, but debate the policy. But we know that across the board, like regardless of where they are in politics, there is this attitude women in politics should shut up, like, which is kind of, and needs to be challenged and needs to be called out. And I think that was the important thing. There was nothing wrong with David Tennant challenging Kemi's policy, but it was the manner in which he went about it.
I'm struggling with that. So if that had been a male politician and he said, you need to shut up about migrants and stop demonizing them, that would have been okay. But by virtue of her being a woman, it's not.
No, I think it adds a dimension to it. I think part of it is David Tennant, I don't think would have said it of a male politician. I don't think he'd have told a male politician to shut up.
That's interesting.
Interesting.
I accept that point, that maybe there is an underlying misogyny in even deciding to take that approach with a politician.
And what does this mean for the Tory leadership race? We've talked about this on the show before, that the ECHR has sort of become the football that most of them are now. I mean, I think even Tom Tugendhat had said he would consider taking us out of it. how much more sort of culture war-esque argument are we likely to see over the next month?
So I think the really interesting thing on the ECHR is, and has quite surprised me, is it is definite the football, but I thought by now more candidates would have come out and said leave, and I think at the moment it is only Jenrick who has said that. What is interesting is cleverly Priti Patel, Kemi basically said, didn't rule it out, said it won't answer all the problems. Tom Tugendhat's kind of similar. So I think it's interesting that there is that sort of guardrail. And I think there's going to be a test now, basically, for the Conservatives. Does Jenrick's all or nothing approach show that, the way the Conservative membership are, that's what you've got to do to win, which I think would have consequences for the future. I should say it was quite interesting when we tested Jenrick in these focus groups. He was the one that most struggled on personal appeal. Particularly, he didn't. People sort of recoiled. They thought that there was something maybe a bit nasty about him or something like that, which they didn't say of any of the others. So I think it's interesting. I think
am amazed people have not kind of clocked that before.
There is a risk, I think. So if Jenrick wins, he'll have to think about his image and how he uses.
Well, he's had a glow up. He has had a glow up.
Yeah, but the eyes, man. No, seriously, it's like when in the horror films, like the demon takes you over and it all becomes black. It feels a little bit like that. He's got shark eyes.
Hello, this is Luke from the future. We now know the result of the first ballot of the Tory leadership contest, with Priti Patel knocked out first. A bit of a surprise that it was her on 14 votes rather than Mel Stride, who was the first to be knocked out. In many ways, a much closer result than we were expecting. None of the candidates got more than a quarter of the vote. Good for Jenrick's momentum that he comes out on top, but only on 27. Kemi Badenoch on 22, just one ahead of James Cleverly, which I think she will be disappointed with as a result there. Very good for James Cleverly to get so close. And interestingly, the fact that between them, Tom Tugendhat, James Cleverly and Mel Stride, seen as the more centrist of the candidates, although those labels can be a bit tricky, got more than 50 votes between them, suggests one of them could make it to the final two. Where does that leave us? I think that some of Patel's votes will go to Cleverly, some to Jenrick, maybe some to Kemi. But overall, I think it means that MPs don't think any of them are the finished final package. And what happens at party conference, those speeches are going to matter even more than we thought they might if this ballot had been less close between the candidates.
Anyway, we're going to now give you all a call to action, and there really can only be one this week. Please do go and check out grenfellunited.org.uk, and if you can support them and help them, please do. They are representing the victims, the families, the bereaved, and those that are sort of still living with the consequences of the fire. And if you can support them in any way, we'd be very, very grateful. At the top of the show, I mentioned how kind and clever our listeners are. Our haters, not so much. So we are back with another round of our, I'm sorry to say, Paul, Oasis-inspired section titled, You Gotta Troll With It. Alex, what have you got for us this week?
So the reason I love this, someone approached me on Twitter with a very abusive message along the lines of abuse. Why don't you do an episode about how Sir Keith is punching down on pensioners to line the pockets of his union boss paymasters or whatever. Abuse. And I said, well, we did one, actually. I don't agree with your framing, but we did discuss it, the trade-off and whether it's the right one or not, to which I got more abuse. So I blocked them. They then followed me on Blue Sky, opened an account, like freshly minted specifically, in order to ask me, how come you won't answer the question, you fat fuck?
Okay, therein lies the answer.
At which point I blocked him again. So then he messaged the Blue Sky Quiet Riot account to complain that I keep blocking him. Sorry, Ryan L. I mostly do socials for the pod, so that's still me. So I blocked him from that one. So then he sent a message to Quiet Riot via the web form to the webmaster on our side.
Which
the
News
little
alert.
form asks.
Alex
which
receives.
Sorry, Ryan, still me, mate. And the form asks, how can we help? Basically, where you fill in the thing. And his response was, you can help by not blocking everyone who asks you to talk about something, you utterly embarrassing weirdos. Thanks. And I love the persistence of that. Like, if I get anything less than a horse's head through the mail next, it will be a massive anticlimax. And I just wonder whether I should continue this, whether I should write to Ryan as a sort of, because he has provided his full name and email on the web form. Yeah. So whether I should write to Ryan as a sort of HR person saying, we're very distressed to hear that Mr. Andreou has been rude to you. Can you tell us what happened?
You're not going to have him as a guest on the show.
Almost inevitably.
I don't care what they may think of me. I'm happy-go-lucky, they say that I'm plucky, contented and carefree.
Future happiness cannot compensate for current misery. Lost happiness is lost forever. Those are the words from our guest best-selling book, Happiness by Design, that have stuck with me most vividly since reading it some years ago. Because that is something I did a lot, and still do, but less. The bargains we strike with ourselves to justify the unpleasant, the dull, the wasteful in exchange for a future that never quite arrives. And it is no coincidence that I read that perspective-shifting sentence at a time when I was looking after my mother, who had Alzheimer's, who was trying to teach me in her way, it turns out, the value of existing in that moment, of being mercurial, of letting go of things quickly, of pleasing your body as well as your mind. So I could not be happy to be sitting across the studio from the man himself. Paul, your work, while wrapped by marketing, I suspect, in a crinkly self-help wrapper, is actually much more political than that.
That was so kind until then. I thought there had to be something coming.
But it is quite political. The book is not what you expect from looking at the book.
Interesting.
Is what I mean. You expect something quite American and fluffy in many ways.
What, like get up, meditate?
And it's actually, and it's actually more profound, it's
journaling.
punchier, and it's much more political. And your next project is about becoming wedded to beliefs and the polarization of opinion. It is that political bridge, I guess, that I want to pick at first. We have arrived at a place where a lot of the discourse, political discourse, I mean, especially from the extremes of both sides of politics, is less about making ourselves better off, happier, well-adjusted, and more about making our foes unhappy. Has it always been thus? Is it worse than it was?
It's a super question, and I'm sure Luke has a good answer to that question. I mean, of course, obviously, I would love to have lots of data that could speak to that question. And of course, we have very little generational data, data from 50, 60, 70 years ago. So a lot of it is what people speculate as to be the case. And of course, that's a hopeless,
loaded with nostalgia
way in which to, talk about science. So the short answer would be I don't know, and that would be the honest answer. I think very few people would actually be able to answer that.
Okay, so
forget that question. But
forget the development of it. Why do we get pleasure from other people doing badly?
Well, obviously we'll come on to the impact that social media has had, because that's clearly what has changed significantly over the last decade or two. Okay, before that then, the answer to the question, when we're thinking about what shapes people's behaviour, the simplest thing is that people do things that are easy. I mean, that's, if you want to make it more likely that someone does something, make it easy. That's a very simple, 101 answer. So it's much easier, much of the time, to hold someone else responsible for how you think the world is than it is to do anything about it yourself.
Yeah.
So the path of least resistance is blame in many cases. So let's shout and be angry at the other side, because that, in a way, absolves me from doing anything about it actively myself from my side. So that would have always been there. There's nothing new about the human condition. What's happened that's made that even more likely and easier? Well, it must be social media to some degree, because it's now even easier than it once was to blame and to shout and to scream and to hold other people to account in a way that you wouldn't yourself. Yeah. So we have some suggestive. So this is not published work, but here's a illustration of this. If we take people who we've identified as being quite inequality averse, and they move into areas where inequality is higher, we have some suggestion that they become more blaming of the political parties that they would associate with being the causes of inequality. So they hate the Tories more, right? Rather than actively doing something about the inequality themselves, because that's much harder. It's much easier. It is then to blame other people. So I think that's a kind of there'll be other data that other people can speak to that would indicate this idea that shouting at the other side is a relatively easy thing to do and can make you feel quite good about yourself as well at the same time. And of course, so just one final thing on that is you don't get to see the feedback of your actions in the way that you do in real life interactions. So if I start screaming at Luke, I'm going to see that he reacts in a particular way. When I do that online, there's absolutely no feedback that I get. And whilst being
unless you're Alex Andreou, and then the feedback comes at you from a million different.
Last week I interviewed an anthropologist about tribalism, and he was saying almost exactly the same thing. That conversations in real life are collaborative. We are actually trying to get somewhere together, but an environment in which you can drop the most toxic bomb, basically, in terms of conversation, just walk away, is a really alien one, and one that is changing our behavior in really unpredictable ways.
So there's a lot of talk of rational behavior being cleansed of emotion, but actually it turns out that having emotional feedback from our actions is the most effective way to make effective decisions. So you need that regulation. And so when I'm interacting with people, I get part of that regulation from the feedback of their reactions to me in a way that I don't get that when I'm online and I'm doing and saying all sorts of things that I can't see the impact of, basically.
The feedback that you do get is from your in-group.
Yes.
And this is, I think, one of the bigger drivers. I agree with everything you've said, but I would add to that that the desire for in-group approval, which social media gives you, means that you say, so if, someone who is reform adjacent says something really radical about owning the libs, they're going to get loads of likes and retweets from reform people. If someone on the left does a Sir Keith meme about Keir Starmer, they're going to get loads of things. And that encourages you. So it's not just that you don't see the impact you're having on the people you're targeting, you're also getting validation from people who say your views, and that becomes a sort of, so it's totally asymmetric there, and it's a real problem.
Yes. Do we have any data, Luke, about whether we're happier or less happy as a...
We are definitely less happy overall. There has definitely been. So Cameron obviously started tracking.
Yes. Well, sorry, that wasn't. Sorry, I didn't know that was the question. I thought you were talking about in relation to polarisation. So we know about. So we do know quite a bit about happiness over time. Well, at least over the last decade, globally. Yeah. And this is borne out by Gallup World Poll data. It's pretty unequivocal. The reports of negative emotion, of pain and worry, stress, sadness, have increased everywhere across the world. The slope is different across nations, but it's increased everywhere across the world since 2008, since the financial crisis. That's a pretty clear finding.
And which countries are happier?
Well, when you ask, a lot turns on the questions that you ask. So when we wrote the questions that are being used now by the Office for National Statistics, I was very proud of the fact that I recommended to the ONS that they ask 4 questions and not just one. They now have 4 questions that essentially tap into people's reflections on life, their life satisfaction, how worthwhile their activities are, and then how happy and anxious they were feeling yesterday. So you've got the full suite, if you like, of ways of accessing people's happiness. And we see the averages don't change very much. That's really the sort of punchline, really. They haven't really changed very much, and you can identify some regions that are happier than others. But it's when you drill down into who's feeling less happy over time that you start seeing some interesting patterns emerging. And one universal finding that I just have to say about happiness data, it's probably the most robust finding across all data, across all the world, is a very significant U-shape in age. So it's one of the great pleasures I get of teaching students at LSE is someone who's just coming out the dip of the happiness U-bend. They've got the downward bit of the U-bend to look forward to, and I've got the upward bit as I get older.
But is that not changing with, and Jonathan Haidt's stuff on smartphones basically shows that, like, you know, young women in particular over the past decade have experienced something of a sort of total crash in terms of happiness and well-being, which of course he then goes on to posit is due to smartphones, which I think is quite compelling, but it's not the debate we're having now. But is that borne out in your work?
Yeah, it's true. I mean, it does. If there is a causal effect of social media and smartphones, it is almost certainly more likely to be amongst girls than it is boys. That seems to be a pattern that you can kind of pick up in most of the data.
Or are girls just more likely to report unhappiness than boys? You know, is there a social stigma for boys to talk about how they're feeling?
But it has dipped for girls. I guess it's girls, even if girls have always been more likely.
Right,
it's the fact that since, 2010?
And you do see, and it's also in the reported behaviours data, like self-harming data, for example. So it's not just in happiness reports.
Yeah.
Luke, there aren't many times that I'll speak positively about Jo Swinson's leadership bid to be Prime Minister, as she herself framed it in the 2019 general election.
Attack.
But one of the things with hindsight I think she probably was right about was a happiness minister, and then a kind of an OBR for happiness to do a bit of a sober assessment on whether or not we're getting happier or not as a nation. And I say this because there are the macro things that can make you happy, like the economy's doing well, you're earning enough money to keep a nice roof over your head and have, you know, some small luxuries in life. And then there are the micro things, and the micro things that can make you really, really unhappy. The little things in life that are just becoming even more stressful to cope with. When you were in government, Cameron was attempting to measure happiness, not just GDP. What happened to that? Why did it not gain traction?
I think part of the challenge is people are always going to focus on, and I say this not with judgment from my end, but from people's perceptions, the sort of hard metrics. It's much easier to report on GDP was that, you know, inflation was this. But I do also think if you look, and I share your assessment, if you look at our work over, you know, the past year, over the election, you know, what is making people unhappy is quite linked with the performance of public. It's the fact they can't get a GP appointment. They have to put stuff back at the end of the weekly shop because it's become too expensive. It's, you know, that the local high street feels like it's in decline. Crime is on the rise. So I guess part of the challenge is how do you disentangle happiness from both, as you say, the macroeconomic picture, but also, and I think you're dead right, one of the best things the government could do is that I almost wouldn't be a happiness minister for me. It would be a reducing everyday frictions minister.
Yes, because life is just fucking annoying. Yes. So I've just come back from Ireland, and my mum...
Reducing everyday friction minister is a plan
Snappy.
I can fully get behind.
Minor example here. So I was on holiday in Ireland. I had my 75-year-old mum with me. And as most 75-year-olds, she does need to go to the loo a little bit more frequently than other people. So we went into an O'Brien's, which is a bit like a Pret, say, in England. And I said, look, you go to the loo, I'll buy a bottle of water. And a very young lady came out from behind the counter and said to me, does she just need to use the toilet? And I said, yeah, but I'm getting a water. And she went, don't be paying €2.50 for that tiny little bottle of water. She needs to use the loo, she can use the loo. And I just couldn't believe it. It was such a shock to me because every little part of your day, particularly in an urban environment, but let's not say, rural environments have their stresses and strains too. It does sometimes feel like the whole of our society is designed to catch us out on absolutely everything all the time. So yes, we've got the macro stuff, but those micro things. And Paul, they often say, the old anecdote is it's the little things in life.
Yes,
that keep you happy.
Yes.
And so is it also the little things that can erode that happiness in an instant?
So I think another line, and thank you for drawing attention to that line in Happiness by Design. I think another line is there's a book in the 80s that was called Don't Sweat the Small Stuff. And that's completely wrong. I mean, it's fundamentally wrong. Happiness is in the small stuff. It's in the things that you do day to day that are actually really sometimes quite fucking obvious that you're going to be happier doing, listening to music, going outdoors, helping other people, being with people that you like being with, having new experiences, laughing, right? I mean, they're all things that people say, well, no shit, Professor, like they're obvious. Well, okay, well, why aren't you doing more of them then? And it's because the friction will often get in the way of us doing those things.
And is that maybe part of what explains that U-bend? That as we grow older,
we become
more aware of what makes us happy and slightly more selfish about using the time we have left for that.
Well, it's an open question. I mean, you get that U shape with or without controls. So whether you account for other characteristics of people, you get it pretty much everywhere. So my sense, and I'm starting to do a little bit of work on this, is that it must be something very basic and primal, maybe existential even. So like when you're 18, you don't think about dying. You're going to live forever. When you're 80, you know you're not going to live forever, and you've come to terms with it. When you're in your 40s, you've got your future behind you, and either you've achieved all the things in life that you wanted to, and you realise that they're not the things that make you happy, or most often you haven't achieved them, and you're a little frustrated. And then you get into your 50s, and you start coming to terms with that. And I think there is a real midlife crisis. It is a real phenomenon, and I do think that that's probably an existential crisis.
Can I ask you something else that puzzles me a little bit? Look at the news right now, MAGA in the US, the riots we just had here, the success of the AfD in Germany.
In parts of Germany.
And this is, I think, a concept that a lot of progressives struggle with. I occasionally see that anger and I think, what must it like to live inside your head? Like, it must be quite hellish. So, the purpose-pleasure principle that runs through your work.
Yeah.
I get the purpose of belonging in that sort of group, that tribal group. I don't get the pleasure in being so full of rage all the time.
No.
So how does that make them happy?
Well, it probably doesn't, is the short answer. I mean, the term that's used in political science is affective polarisation, right? So it's affective, it's feelings-based. It's hard to imagine feelings of hostility making you feel happier. I mean, because it's antithetical. I mean, it's the complete opposite of being happy. You're right that sometimes there can be purpose in the anger. People that protest on the streets, they feel like they can act, they can do something. So there is actually maybe a purpose. And actually anger, when directed, can actually be a positive emotion rather
Aristotelian,
than exactly. And that's why I think
with a purpose
exactly, which is why I think purpose is important. But no, in terms of pleasure, it's not obvious at all that's making people any happier to feel so hostile.
Is part of it a sort of loss? It's the opposite. It's a sort of loss aversion which is motivating it. And sort of we've done a lot of work around threat perception. In fact, there was a great piece in this week's Sunday Times by Tom Calver, listeners should read if they're interested, which basically shows that threat perception determines a lot of your outlook on the world. If you think the world's becoming a more dangerous place, you're more likely to, for instance, vote Reform or to vote for parties of Riot, and it becomes a defensive position rather than one which is sort of seeking happiness.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, you do see a lot of the news, stories are clearly around threat, security, fear. And of course, people watch that and listen to that. It is worth saying, though, there's a very cool paper by Katie Miltman in the US that shows, she looks at the virality of different posts and different sentiments that are expressed in the posts. Turns out that awe is one that has the most viral impact. Yeah, so I do think there's something to be said for politicians maybe kind of creating wonder and surprise. Because it activates a very big part of how...
Well, this is my diagnosis of where I think Starmer is getting the needle wrong at the moment, which is, understand, he needs to be realistic. You don't want to do Boris Johnson boosterism because that leads to decline trust. But there needs to be a little bit of and what does it look like when we're over the hill?
And even master of Project Fear, George Osborne, has called him out on this, saying, steady on, fellow, don't keep doing the doom and gloom. Paul, on this show, we like to give our listeners a call to action.
Yes.
Usually it's to support an organisation or things that listeners can actively do in terms of participating in civil society, talking to their MP, etc. On this occasion, though, I'm going to ask you for something a bit different and for some advice on what, as individuals, we can do practically to just make ourselves a little happier. Like, what's the lowest hanging fruit piece of well-being that we could take on as we enter the autumn and winter months to make ourselves a little happier?
Well, it's interesting. In that list that I reeled off, which I got, obviously those sort of come to mind very quickly and very easily, helping other people is a big one. It's a very selfish thing to do to help other people. We get an enormous amount of benefit from it. And to remind ourselves that not only does the other person benefit when we help them, but we feel good from doing so. And I was going to say that in relation, I thought you were going to finish your question with what you were going to ask, and I immediately thought of loneliness. It's where
it's a killer.
It absolutely is a killer. it's homeostatic. It operates on the same thermostat, if you like, as hunger and thirst. I mean, it's that important. But unlike hunger and thirst, when you have less social contact, it diminishes the need for it. So it doesn't take very long for people to become literally isolated, which psychologically and physiologically is really harmful. So maybe just talking to somebody that you know,
never know
or
who's
that you
lonely.
don't know, right? That is actually going to make you feel good and may impact.
I love that example. So after my dad died, my mum made a conscious deal with herself, which was that I'm going to make 10 people smile every day of my life. And what that does is it forces her to get outside the house and to say to herself,
does she still do that?
I'm not doing this for me. I'm doing it because I need to make 10 other people smile. And she will wander around saying to anybody, oh, I like your hat, or, you know, oh, what a cute dog. And by lunchtime, she says, I've usually made 10 people smile, and it gets me out of myself, gets me, you know, and I think that's a lovely example.
And she still does that. So
yeah,
it's
every
kind
day,
of
every day.
Stayed. So some of the evidence from health behaviours is that it takes a couple of months for a habit to embed.
Form.
Yeah, so it doesn't sound very long, but it's actually quite a long, like 60 days of doing something is actually quite a long time. So if she's been doing it 60 days, you know,
it's a habit.
Yeah.
Oh, I don't care. When it comes to happiness, I want my share. Don't try to rearrange me. There's nothing can change me, 'cause I don't care.
And that's the end of this week's show. May I say a massive thank you to our guests, Professor Paul Dolan and Luke Tryl. Thank you, guys.
Thank you both so much.
And thank you to everybody for tuning in. Don't forget to take a few moments to subscribe and rate the show. You can contact us on social media or email at quietriotpod@gmail.com.
Finally, if you have a few quid to spare, bung it our way on ko-fi.com/Quiet Riot Pod. It is the perfect combination, I feel, of pleasure and purpose. And so I'm quite convinced it would make both you and us very happy.
Stay quietly riotous, and we'll speak again very soon. Quiet Riot is an audio production by Cooler Heads with Naomi Smith, Alex Andreou and Kenny Campbell. Music by Mariana Sangita, artwork by Simona Canelu. Quiet Riot is a co-production with Sandstone Global.
Quiet Riot.
Boom.
Lovely.
Amazing.
That was great.
It was so
That flew by.
Really fun.
It did fly by.
That was great.
It did fly by. Yeah.
That really flew. Can you believe we just recorded for an hour and like 10 minutes almost?
Stay. I'm just going to book the studio for another 4 hours.
Forever.
Yeah, thank you so much, both of you. It was,
No,
it was
thank
great.
you.
Brilliant.
It was really good. I really enjoyed that.
It was really fun.
Thank you.
And that was my most fun one I've done.
Oh, good. We're getting better at it.